You lose yourself to find peace, Al-Ghazali's inner formula. You begin with an assumption so deeply ingrained that you rarely question it. The belief that knowledge, once acquired, guarantees truth. You move through life trusting your conclusions because they feel coherent, and you trust coherence because it feels stable. In this initial confidence, you sense no reason to pause. Yet the moment you examine this belief, even briefly, you recognize its fragility. Certainty seems solid only when you avoid investigating its origins. When you do investigate, you find that much of what you call knowledge is inherited, repeated, or assumed. Al-Ghazali encountered this same tension at the beginning of his inquiry. He noticed that the mind often protects its conclusions without understanding them. You begin to ask, if certainty depends on untested assumptions, what exactly sustains it? Al-Ghazali lived in a world filled with competing intellectual claims. Baghdad was alive with theologians defending doctrine, philosophers constructing rational systems, jurists refining legal principles, and mystics seeking a deeper interior truth. Each group asserted that its method provided reliable understanding. This crowded environment created an unusual pressure. Surrounded by confidence on every side, Al-Ghazali found himself questioning not only the content of these ideas but the mechanism through which certainty was formed. If every group claimed truth, how could one verify which claims rested on solid ground? The question became unavoidable: does knowledge reveal truth or merely reflect habit? The more Al-Ghazali examined the structure of knowledge, the more he recognized an unsettling pattern. Logic could support conclusions, but logic itself depended on principles that could not be proven by logic. Theology offered explanations of the world, but those explanations relied on inherited assumptions. Philosophy constructed elaborate frameworks, but each framework assumed the reliability of the mind evaluating it. You begin to sense the depth of this problem. When the very tool you use to verify truth becomes the object of doubt, none of its conclusions can stand firmly. Al-Ghazali realized that the mind can be persuaded without being correct, convinced without being grounded. You ask yourself, if the instrument of knowing is unstable, how can its judgments be secure? As you explore your own experience, you start to see a parallel to Al-Ghazali's crisis. You assume that peace comes from controlling your thoughts, stabilizing your emotions, and organizing your beliefs. You treat the mind as something that must be managed into clarity. Yet this effort rarely produces the result you want. Instead, you notice that control generates tension. The more you try to suppress a thought, the more insistent it becomes. The more you attempt to stabilize your emotions, the more unstable the process feels. The more tightly you cling to an idea, the more defensive you become when it is questioned. Al-Ghazali observed that inner conflict arises not from the content of thoughts, but from the self that insists on shaping them. The sense of being the controller creates pressure, and pressure obscures clarity. When you look closely, you see that control is fueled by fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of losing certainty, fear of not knowing. You begin to wonder whether the self that strives for control is itself the source of unrest. If letting go reduces tension, what exactly was the controller accomplishing? You turn your attention to the structure of the self. You see that what you call I is not a single coherent entity. It is a collection of preferences, beliefs, assumptions, expectations, and narratives accumulated over time. This collection interprets every situation, shaping your reactions before you consciously respond. Al-Ghazali recognized that this interpretive structure creates a barrier between you and reality. The self does not merely observe, it filters, judges, and reshapes whatever it encounters. When you look at the world, you are not seeing it directly. You are seeing it through the lens of past experiences and internal habits. Because this lens is unexamined, you take it as reality itself. You defend your opinions because they feel like extensions of your identity. You resist challenges because they threaten the stability of the lens. In this way, the self becomes an obstruction, not because it is malicious, but because it confuses its interpretations with truth. You begin to understand why peace is elusive. Peace requires seeing clearly, but the self's filters distort what is seen. The more the self insists on being right, the less it can recognize what actually is. You ask, if everything you see is shaped by the lens of self, how can you ever see beyond it? Al-Ghazali proposed that the only way to approach truth is to purify perception. Purification does not refer to moral virtue alone. It refers to reducing the distortions introduced by desire, fear, bias, and self-centered interpretation. Only when these distortions are quiet can clarity emerge. You begin to examine your own perceptions. You see that desire pulls your attention in one direction, fear pulls it in another, and habit leads you down familiar paths without reflection. These forces shape what appears to be true, long before reason has a chance to examine the situation. Purification, then, becomes an act of intellectual honesty. It requires suspending immediate judgments. It requires noticing when an idea feels comforting rather than convincing. It requires distinguishing between what is actually known and what is merely assumed. As you do this, you notice something unusual. When desires and biases temporarily fall silent, the mind becomes more transparent. Thought becomes less defensive. Reality appears less distorted. Al-Ghazali saw this as the beginning of true understanding, not because perception becomes perfect, but because its impurities become visible. And you ask, if clarity emerges only when assumptions fall silent, who was interpreting the world before silence arrived? At a certain point, you notice that striving for clarity has its own limitations. Effort can carry you only so far. The more intensely you search for certainty, the more restless the mind becomes. This restlessness reveals an important insight. Clarity is not produced by force. Al-Ghazali observed that there comes a moment when the seeker must stop insisting. This is not failure nor resignation. It is a recognition of the limits of personal control. You begin to understand that surrender does not mean abandonment. It means releasing the notion that clarity must conform to your expectations. In this moment, the mind loosens its grip. Thoughts arise without the usual pressure to accept or reject them. The self becomes less reactive, less defensive, less demanding. A subtle quietness appears, not because you forced the mind into silence, but because you stopped interfering with its movements. You realize that peace does not emerge from achieving a specific state. It emerges from the absence of insistence, the ending of inner resistance. And the question arises, if peace appears when you stop asserting yourself, what was the self ever adding to the process? Reason now becomes the focus of your inquiry. You see its strengths clearly. It allows you to question assumptions, identify contradictions, and evaluate beliefs. It can refine your understanding and expose your errors. These abilities are essential in any search for truth. Yet Al-Ghazali discovered a boundary beyond which reason cannot pass. Reason can examine concepts, but it cannot verify the ultimate reliability of its own foundations. It can analyze the world, but it cannot escape the fact that it operates within the limits of the mind. It can evaluate arguments, but it cannot determine the final nature of reality. You begin to notice this boundary within yourself. The more you rely on reason alone, the more circular the process becomes. Every conclusion depends on another conclusion. Every argument rests on assumptions that reason cannot prove. Every certainty collapses when examined deeply enough. This does not diminish the value of reason. Instead, it reveals its proper place. Reason can guide you to the threshold of understanding, but it cannot cross it. What lies beyond is not irrational. It is simply not accessible through analysis alone. You begin to ask, if reason can approach truth but cannot enter it, what receives truth when reasoning stops? At this point, the central insight begins to surface. Peace does not depend on acquiring more knowledge or mastering mental techniques. Peace appears when the self becomes transparent, when the interpreter no longer distorts experience by imposing expectations, fears, and judgments. You start to observe the self directly. You see how it claims ownership of thoughts, how it interprets events through personal narratives, how it insists on being the center of every experience. This insistence creates friction. It generates tension. It narrows perception. Al-Ghazali taught that losing the self does not mean erasing individuality. It means recognizing that the self is not the foundation of awareness. The self is a structure within awareness, not the owner of it. When this distinction becomes clear, the self's grip loosens. As the self becomes less central, peace becomes more accessible. You experience moments in which the interpreter is quiet, and experience unfolds without interference. These moments feel simple, balanced, and unforced, not because you created them, but because you stopped obstructing them. You begin to see that peace was never missing. It was overshadowed by the one who kept searching for it. And the question emerges, if peace appears when you disappear, who is present to experience it? You arrive at a quiet recognition. Truth is not something you grasp. It is something that becomes evident when the constant activity of seeking settles. Al-Ghazali's inner formula shows that peace is not an achievement or possession. It is the condition that remains when the self stops interfering. In this stillness, the boundaries between thinker and thought soften. The tension between reason and understanding dissolves. You recognize that what you called knowledge was often a collection of claims, while what you now sense is an openness that requires no claim. There is no final conclusion, only the clarity that emerges when seeking ends. And you ask, with no urgency, if stillness is what remains when the searcher stops claiming truth, what was the search ever looking for?